So thank you for joining us today for this Schemel Forum World Affairs Luncheon. My name is Julie Schumacher-Cohen. I serve the University of Scranton as Assistant Vice President for Community Engagement and Government Affairs, and I'm pleased to have the honor of introducing the program and our guest speaker today. The forum today is co-sponsored by the Weinberg Memorial Library, the Department of Political Science, the Ella Korea Initiative, and the Office of Community Relations. And I want to give a special credit to a sophomore political science student, Jackson Morris, who is the nephew of our guest speaker, who brought the idea of today's program to me in the fall. So we're grateful to Jackson, who's over here, for introducing his uncle, Richard Greene, to the university. Today's topic is, of course, particularly timely. We didn't know even how timely when we were planning it in the fall. Gaza, Ukraine, and Sudan, humanitarian responses and challenges as conditions on the ground in these places remain dire, and as the landscape for American and global humanitarian aid has shifted in recent weeks with significant policy changes underway in regard to U.S. foreign assistance as well as U.S. foreign policy. This is also a time when around 300 million people globally are in need of humanitarian assistance, and 120 million people are forcibly displaced. So thankfully, we have someone with vast knowledge and experience in these areas. So let me tell you a little bit about Richard Greene. He has dedicated his career to the advancement of foreign policy goals through leadership positions in the federal government, the United Nations, and the private sector, where he supported humanitarian and disaster relief and stabilization operations across the globe. Currently, he's a consultant, advisor, and frequent public speaker on these issues. Most recently, he served as senior advisor and counselor to UNICEF, focusing on supporting humanitarian response efforts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Venezuela, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Central America, and the West Bank and Gaza. Earlier, Rich was president of Pacific Architects and Engineers Global Logistics and Stability Operations Business Unit, and in that capacity, he led a team of over 8,000 employees who operated on all 7 continents. At the U.S. Department of State, he served as acting director of the Office of Foreign Assistance and as Assistant Secretary of State and Chief Financial Officer. And he also served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. So again, we're honored. Please join me in welcoming Richard Greene to the University of Scranton.
I have to give another shout out to Jackson, or his mother will be very mad at me. So second shout out to Jackson, and a shout out to somebody who, I don't know if you guys have heard of, Michael Dignam, who is a proud graduate of Scranton, who I worked with very closely at Lockheed and PAE afterwards, who sent me a text earlier this morning that said, "Go Royals." And Frank, I had no idea who the Royals were, but anyway. So let me just give some overview themes and then dive into some of what Julie mentioned a little bit deeper. So first, there are hundreds of millions of people, 380 million people around the world, in need of some form of life-sustaining humanitarian assistance, be it shelter, be it food, be it security, just be it basic education for the kids, be it access for some sort of health response. And the people that respond to this humanitarian response, in many respects, is the ultimate team sport. You look at who's involved with it. It's people that work for corporations, that work for UN agencies, that work for NGOs, that work for contractors, that work for foundations, that work for the Red Cross movement. And this amalgam is basically made up of people who, I like to say, run to the fire. They run to conflict. They run to protect people. They sort of live for these situations, and they're not any different or better than me or anybody in this crowd. It's just what they do, and it's just what they're made up of. And it's been a privilege for me to work with hundreds, if not thousands, of these people throughout my career. They also many of them tell great stories about crises they've gone through at night when we're drinking beer around the fire. So you've got this army, this global amalgam made up of people who run to the fire. And the United States has traditionally been the leading provider in terms of funding, in terms of people on the ground, in terms of intellectual leadership in humanitarian situations around the world. And I think that's something that's important. I think it represents the best of what we're about as a country. And I think, frankly, it's one of the best things that we have going for us as a country. It's one of the key components of our national security toolkit, which includes defense, diplomacy, development. And it's one of the most effective things we can do. You can measure the success of what we do, the impact, the lives we've saved, the lives we've altered. And also, what's not really talked about is there's usually a strong system of diligence, making sure that the assistance goes to who it's supposed to go to. So you got this amalgam of people doing good stuff made up of lots of different organizations. And it's not easy to keep this amalgam together and to keep this humanitarian response network together. There's a zillion moving parts, which sort of gets at some of the things the administration has unleashed in terms of shutting down portions of the network. And you just think about what's involved with even taking things like vaccines that need cold storage and moving them from a manufacturing plant in Europe or here and keeping them in cold storage and getting them to Sudan or South Sudan or Somalia, and all the different moving pieces that are necessary to keep that vaccine safe and cold and ready for delivery. And it's everybody always, in this business always talks about the challenges of the last mile. Once stuff shows up on the tarmac, on planes or truck convoys, how do you get it to the population in need that's probably off-road or not anywhere near the airport or 200 miles away? And so think in your minds about how difficult it is to actually get stuff to people in the middle of conflicts and all the different moving pieces. And frankly, what you don't want to do is do things that try to disrupt that capacity. And frankly, that capacity has been disrupted by recent Trump administration actions. And I don't say that in a partisan way. I work for Republican administrations. In fact, most of my appointments were part of Republican administrations. But the entire U.S. aid workforce, or almost the entire U.S. aid workforce, has been told to leave posts, leave missions, and go back to headquarters and wait for whatever. Contracts have been canceled, programs have been shut down, and there is just chaos in this sort of fragile systems that's necessary to get life-sustaining assistance to people on the ground. Some waivers, humanitarian waivers, are being issued, but it's just a really opaque process and a lot of uncertainty with the people that do this work, and a lot of uncertainty as to what happens next. And at the same time, people that do foreign assistance, people that deliver humanitarian assistance, frankly, feel like they're under attack, and for reasons that they don't really understand and can't really explain. You got an awful lot of people who run to the fire, who've worked in war zones in Iraq or Afghanistan or Somalia or Syria, and now they feel like there's no appreciation for what they've done, and they're being called back. And there are all kinds of allegations about fraud and malfeasance. Now, I made this point in an earlier conversation in your class, and I'll make it here again. I think there is a big difference between an incoming administration saying that they want to review programs, which every incoming administration should want to do, and deciding that a lot of programs that were implemented by the previous administration, say for climate change, or DEI, or reproductive sexual health, or even some of the economic development ones, they don't like them. They think they should not be high priorities. Okay, fine. But there's a big difference between having policy difference about all these programs and saying they're fraudulent. I've been there. A lot of my colleagues have been there. They're not fraudulent. All there are people delivering on the policy priorities of the previous administration. And that's what public servants, that's what people on part of these organizations are supposed to do. There's not anyone who works in the humanitarian system, who works on development, who doesn't think that it can't be that that assistance can't be targeted and delivered more efficiently. I mean, there's stories about, the endless meetings you go to, the endless checks, all the reports you have to do, which leads to incredible levels of frustration. And so anyone involved with the system can think of lots of different ways where it could become more efficient and probably even cheaper and faster and work better. But that doesn't mean it's fraudulent. It doesn't mean people have been doing illegal things. That doesn't mean people haven't been implementing the program and objectives of the United States. We're the most powerful country in the world. Foreign assistance accounts for less than 1% of our total budget. In my view, it's not either or. It's not that you do foreign assistance or you don't, or that money goes to other things. Great countries do foreign assistance, and they do great programs in their own countries as well. Humanitarian assistance is probably 40% of that 1%. And so my message through all this and the groups I talk to is let's continue to lead with compassion and continue to lead with big hearts. In terms of my background, Julie mentioned some of it. Again, I worked in senior positions in both Democratic and Republican administrations. And yeah, I'll give you sort of, and we took direction from whoever was in charge. I was a political appointee and I was also a career appointee. I'll give you one Hillary Clinton story told to me by her top staffer, whose name I won't say to protect the innocent. So I left about a year. I worked for about a year into Hillary's tenure as Secretary of State, and then left to work for Lockheed. And had my sort of exit interview with Hillary and this other person. And, they were asking me things about, what I thought about the place. And I go, okay, you're asking me all this stuff. I want to hear what you have to say. What surprised you guys, Hillary and this wonderful person who was her top aide? What surprised you guys the most? And Hillary said, what surprised the most was that you guys, meaning, the career people that run the place, actually liked us and supported us and listened to us and wanted to do what we suggested you do. And that's what every senior team does in every federal agency. And I was just like surprised that they were surprised. They thought it would be, people would have their own political agendas and all this stuff. I don't see the political agendas. I and many wonderful colleagues that I worked with for a number of years, we didn't have political agendas. Our agenda was to deliver on the national security objectives of the United States of America, full stop. I often, in my travels and the various things I've done, I often think back to some of the conversations I've had and some of the people I've met. I mentioned some of this in your class. And met some incredible people. And my takeaway, and I always used to say this to everybody I came back to, including my children, is that people in these conflict situations, living in refugee camps, living in the most horrible situations you can imagine, they wanted the exact same things for themselves and their family that I wanted for myself and my family. They wanted to be safe. They wanted their kids to have a chance to get an education. They wanted the chance to go out and do some work that would allow them to take care of their families. And and that's kind of it. And that's the same thing, I wanted for my family and for my kids. And I think that's sometimes you look at people living in these challenging circumstances through no fault of their own in refugee camps and displaced camps, and you think, if they're living in those situations, it's their fault. It's not their fault. They're not living in miserable conditions because they chose to. They're living in miserable conditions because they were driven out by conflict, by discrimination, by famine, by some health situation, by climate change. And, always always used to be our theme in terms of working with people, look at who you're talking to, imagine what they're going to, know and take in the humanity of the situation. What I want to do is to dive into, and then some of the other examples. I won't repeat my El Salvador story. I told you the El Salvador story. Spent a lot of time in South Sudan in various refugee situations with women, frankly, all who were much taller than I was, wanting to do nothing but somehow get a little bit of money, a little bit of training to start up a business, to take care of their family. Bangladesh with Rohingyas that were driven out by genocide in Myanmar and Burma. Again, wanting to figure out how can they get their kids into some sort of continuing, we talked a little bit about this, some sort of continuing education situation. We don't want them to have to sit there in a refugee camp and not learn for 5 years and to be yet another wasted generation. In Somalia, met with a lot of people looking just to start, refugees and people living on the economy, just to start a business, trying to get the information, trying to get money, try to get something going where they can just take care of basic necessities. The same kind of things that we think about here. Then those stories, those little people that do this work, those vignettes, they sort of stay with you, your life and your career, and you come away, I've just been extraordinarily lucky given the life that I've lived here and and that's what I used to tell my kids when I come home from these trips. The only difference between you and a lot of these kids I met and listened to is you're lucky and they're not, and that's it. They're probably, because of what they have to put up with every day, are probably sharper and stronger and better to put up with things that life throws at you than you are because of the circumstances they're in. And don't think for a second that just because they live in horrible situations, it reflects on that's what they want to do. So let me kind of take all that and just dive a little bit into more of the detail in some of these situations. Leading with how we, the U.S. government, foundations that contribute a lot, again, we are the global leader in humanitarian response. That is a national attribute that I think we should cling to and support and make sure it doesn't disappear in any of the contretemps that's taking place right now in Washington. I think it's one of the most important positive attributes of our foreign policy. And I think, again, it best reflects our national compassion. And it best reflects our national compassion, and it's directly linked to our national security objectives as a country. It's not something we just do on the side. It's directly part of what we think we need to do in terms of national security. In 2024, humanitarian response in the humanitarian world, 2024 was just an absolute disaster. There was conflict and unrest intensified in Haiti, in Lebanon, Gaza, obviously, Sudan, Mali, Ukraine, DRC, many other places. And at the same time, as conflicts ensued, there were millions of people displaced by extreme weather, storms, floods, droughts. 2024 was the deadliest year for humanitarian workers on record. Assaults on humanitarian workers were also record numbers. Attacks on things like hospitals and schools were also occurred in record numbers. Overall, the number of people in the world that have been displaced by conflict is estimated at about 120 million, and that's triple what it was 10 years ago. And I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you because I think you can better appreciate the situation by hearing the numbers and even in your mind comparing the numbers to the populations of Scranton or Pennsylvania. So the number of people displaced by conflict has tripled, and the trend lines are all negative. The global humanitarian system, and I talked about this amalgam and all the different partners at the beginning of this, is overstretched and underfunded. And there are approximately 380 million people needing some form of humanitarian support, be it food, be it medical, be it shelter, be it some access to health, education, some form of protection every day. And the numbers continue to rise, and frankly, the funding hasn't kept up. And I was telling your class, I had lots of discussions on funding. One of the key points in terms of humanitarian assistance is that there is no humanitarian solution to humanitarian challenges. There's not a humanitarian assistance that will solve a humanitarian conflict. And what I mean by that is even if you manage to get in life-saving health, shelter, security, food, that doesn't resolve the underlying political security challenges, mess, conflict that led to displacing the millions of people that you're trying to keep alive. The assistance does keeps people alive, provides some sort of serious hope that there is perhaps the hope for a better future, but it really doesn't do a lot to help people in need return to some sort of normalcy they had before they were displaced by conflict or war or famine. And again, that only happens with some sort of a sustained political security response. It doesn't happen by getting in more food and more assistance. You keep people alive, you keep hope alive. You only solve things by getting a political or a security solution. And part of the challenges now is that many of the instruments, the international instruments usually people rely on to get those political security solutions, the UN and others, just have not been effective for a whole variety of reasons, so we can go through that later. The UN Security Council just doesn't work anymore, and a lot of the regional forums haven't really developed to the point where they're effective players on this. There are 120 million people who have been forcibly displaced by conflict, and as I said, we live in the aftermath of what was the most violent decade ever in terms of humanitarian conflicts. And the conflicts that have displaced so many people, they just keep on keeping on. I'll go through a little bit some of the positive stories like Syria, but for the most part, the average duration of a conflict now is about 10 years. And the ones that happened 10 years ago and 5 years ago and 3 years ago, they just keep on keeping on. And they just pile on top of each other. And think through in your mind what that does to all the organizations, the groups that are supposed to respond to these things. It just really taxes them. And think about, more importantly, what it does to the people on the ground if you're sitting there in a conflict situation for 5, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years in some of these situations. And we're talking about, obviously, Gaza, Sudan, Haiti, DRC, Lebanon, Venezuela. And it's almost paradoxically, that's the only word I can come up with today. I use this for a couple of examples, that almost every one of these conflict situations, they were man-made and predictable. It was predictable that the Russians were going to go into Ukraine. It was predictable, given the amount of intel available, that Hamas was going to attack Israel. It was predictable that the ferocity of the Israeli response to the Gaza heinous, horrible activity on October 7th, the Israeli response was predictable. It was predictable that there would be major battles in Goma and DRC now. And so if you're on the other side, I would think, okay, if all this is predictable, why wasn't more effort? Why couldn't there have been more done to stop these predictable actions that have caused so much harm to millions of civilians around the world? There are some positive developments in the humanitarian area, and the most recent one is obviously Syria, where Assad fled to Moscow, and so far it seems to be working pretty well. And the amazing thing about Syria is that with all the intel analysts, foreign policy analysts in the world, there wasn't a single person who predicted this would take place. And so a pox on everybody that does that for a living, probably like me. But it's an incredibly positive development for millions, tens of millions of long-suffering Syrians. And we're talking about at the table. I'm sure there'll be lots of Syrians returning, maybe more in the near countries than Europe and Scandinavia, but probably be lots of pressure on Syrians to return. But an incredibly positive development for Syrians. Another positive development in the midst of all the destruction in Gaza is that phase one of the ceasefire seems to be sort of kind of holding. Prisoner exchanges have taken place per schedule. The amount of trucks getting in I saw a number of 900 a couple days ago, has increased. We'll see if we can get to the more challenging phase two and phase three, but that's good. The number of access in Sudan, which is often described as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world that nobody really cares about or pays attention to, has increased pretty dramatically. Recently, too, as there is pretty strong pushback against RSF in several places. The Lebanon ceasefire seems to be sort of kind of holding, and that's positive for the people there. But I would say that even in these circumstances where there's positive developments, there's incredible challenges. There'll be incredible challenges for Syrians coming back to Syria with just probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of unexploded ordnance, with buildings destroyed right and left, with no water infrastructure. Gaza, you guys have seen what Gaza looks like now, and so even all the hundreds of thousands of people that were allowed to move back to northern Gaza moved back to complete destruction of any infrastructure and houses. And Gaza is still a hot zone. Afghanistan, positive, I mentioned this before, in that security is probably better in Afghanistan now than it's been for the last, say, 15 years with the Taliban taking over the country. So on one hand, that's a good environment for providers to go out and do what they do in terms of health, education, maybe just some development stuff. On the other hand, probably the more important hand, women and children of Afghanistan are treated like chattel and have no rights, and there's no education for any girl above, I think, like sixth grade in Afghanistan. And they're basically, you have improved security and you have women and children that basically have no rights left in Afghanistan. But at least you can drive around and not get killed. But some positive developments, and some would say that, security has increased so much there that perhaps provides a basis for international engagement and maybe doing more and trying to get relief on women and children rights. So you have some positive developments, but it's still an increasingly dangerous world. And again, you see what happens in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and many other conflicts keep on going on. 233,000 people were killed in conflicts in 2024. The conflicts have gotten much more dangerous because of the access to weapons of destruction, maybe not weapons of mass destruction, but weapons of destruction in terms of long-range missiles, in terms of drones, suicide drones, and just the number of casualties from these attacks is increasing exponentially. There has been a rise in basically in impunity and people just not paying the slightest attention to basic humanitarian laws about protecting civilians and protecting schools and hospitals. And that has made things even more challenging and even more dangerous. And non-state actors like ISIS, which is still there, and in fact reestablished a large presence in Somalia, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram are still out there, other organizations, and still causing major challenges in terms of what they do to the population and trying to get assistance. Diving down a little bit more into the numbers, in Ukraine, 4 out of 10 people need humanitarian assistance. 3.5 million have been displaced within the country. 6.7 million people have left Ukraine and gone to primarily neighboring countries, Poland and others. It's actually beyond remarkable about how receptive neighboring countries in Ukraine have been to people that have been driven out. And countless attacks in Ukraine occur every day on energy infrastructure and on skills, on schools, on civilians. I mean, the Russians don't even pretend like they're trying to hit military targets. And on the sort of eastern part of Ukraine, it's just like trench warfare. It's like World War I with same type of casualties. In Gaza, 80% of the infrastructure is destroyed, 100% of the population displaced. There's an estimate of 50,000 people have been killed. I'm sure the number will go up significantly once you start to pull rubble out and do buildings. Need some? Then the needs in Gaza are just overwhelming in terms of just simple things like tents with some sort of lining to get through the winter, just basic access to water, basic health. People basically have nothing in Gaza. In Sudan, the country is just bleeding out from the civil war between the Sudan Armed Forces and the RSF, which did a good job of genocide in Darfur 20 years ago. Over the weekend, RSF hit a hospital, killed 80 people. There's a siege around El Fasher now, where there's hundreds of thousands of displaced Sudanese are basically caught, and RSF getting closer and closer to take care of that. And at Bay, for any of you that remember the Darfur battles and campaigns, this is the exact same thing is being repeated. And sort of another Sudan thought that South Sudan is probably one of the most poorest countries in the world, basically a miserable place with nothing there. And what does that say about the conditions in Sudan if 1.2 million Sudanese have left to go to South Sudan? It just is a sign of desperation. Another sort of overall theme I want to leave you with is that despite increases in agricultural production and technology, it's still a pretty hungry world out there. And WFP estimates are there are about 750 million people who are chronically undernourished and facing hunger every day. That plays into all this. Climate change exacerbates all this. There are 1 billion children, my former place of work, UNICEF always says there's 1 billion children that live in climate change impacted areas, and it's causing more and more damage every day with droughts and floods and storms. There's a global learning crisis. Another statistic we used to put out at UNICEF, 7 of 10 kids 10 years old cannot read and understand a simple sentence. Read the sentence and understand what it says, which is a remarkable statistic to me. And there's still global health challenges and crises all over the place. We didn't seem to have learned too much in terms of coordination and preparation for after COVID. Ebola outbreak right now in Uganda. The U.S. dropping out of the World Health Organization isn't going to help that in terms of global coordination. So I've laid out some of these challenges, laid out some of the stark numbers, and let me just kind of run through some of the things that are necessary to support any successful humanitarian intervention, and just to show you how challenging it is, how technical it is, what a serious business it is, and how if you disrupt part of it, it has huge implications on the people you're trying to get to and protect. First, you have to have access to impacted populations. If you can't reach the people, if fighting or conflict or roads out or no access for other reasons keeps you can't do your work. Number one is having access to populations. Number two we talked a little bit about this in your class, is security. Security is paramount. Taking care of your people, taking care of your team, ensuring you can do your work, and frankly, stay alive. And a lot of the conversations about how you do that, particularly in conflict zones. Funding is paramount. Almost all of the organizations funded to do humanitarian relief are funded by voluntary payments, and each year you got to go out and raise significant amounts of funding. At UNICEF, which has a popular brand and everybody thinks you're doing good stuff because it's children, we had to go out and raise, now it's up to $8 billion a year annually, and it can become quite challenging. Supply chain, how do you get stuff from warehouses? How do you get food? How do you get medical stuff? How do you get the stuff to, tents from wherever they are in whatever warehouse in, Dubai, Europe, here, in parts of Africa? How do you move all those large volumes of things from the warehouses to actually get to the people in need of assistance? It's a really tricky process. One example of that, when WFP finally had approval to move trucks in Sudan to sort of the outskirts of El Fasher, the truck convoy, the large truck convoy, took them I think it was 30 days, and they had to go through 40 different checkpoints to go through and get the food to the people that needed it. And the guys driving the trucks, would just, park at night, sleep on the road. I mean, just amazing logistical challenges. Another component is staff. Who do you hire? How do you get people that know how to survive in these situations? And have the right kind of temperament, the right skill set, the right, how are you gonna motivate them when they wake up every day and see the challenges that the people that they're trying to protect are doing. Leadership. Often in these situations, the headquarters teams, the first discussion is, okay, like in any business, who are you going to get that's going to go out and you're going to put in this conflict situation that can figure out how to lead the team and get the job done in terms of delivering assistance to hundreds of thousands of people. What type of person do we want? What type of experience do they have? And you spend a lot of time on leadership discussions. Local connections. You're only as good as your connections with local organizations on the ground, with local populations. Language skills are really important. And so you need people that know how to connect with populations. And you need to integrate those local groups into your plan. Transport becomes just one of the most important things. How do you move people? How do you move stuff? Do you have access to helicopters, trucks? What happens when the road ends? Do you use mule convoys, which are used in a lot of places? Patience and humility are so important for people that do this. As I always said, the people that do the best in these kind of situations are low maintenance. They don't need a lot. They can, they just sort of take care of themselves, and they're not whiners, they're not complainers. They sort of like to use the British expression of keeping calm and carrying on, and that's sort of the best attribute. So I applaud you guys being interested in these issues. There has been a lot more attention than I would have thought and hoped to, given some of the early Trump administration actions. Again, anybody involved in the business would welcome any conversation to look at making it more efficient. The way it's done now is almost like a decapitation, as opposed to trying to make it more efficient. Hopefully cooler heads will prevail, and we won't lose some of our capacity. It's a challenging world out there. It's been one of the best components of who we are as a country and what we do as a country to help lead the challenges in these situations around the world. And don't let the the hostility of the conversations in Washington deter you from wanting to be informed and wanting to be involved. There's really important stuff to be done, and frankly, we Americans, we roll up our sleeves and we figure out how to get really important stuff done one way or another. So, thank you.
If anybody has any questions for Richard, just raise your hand, and I'll run over with the mic.
Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate your whole overview there. I have a practical question. When is the best time to donate? What time of the year is best for folks?
Any fundraiser would say anytime. So what fundraisers are always looking for, and thank you for raising the question, is sort of dependency, volume, obviously, and flexibility. And flexibility is really important. There's this whole argument about how having funds earmarked for particular projects really hamper your ability running an organization to move it from one area to another and put it where the place where it's most needed. So unearmarked donations are like gold, man. And you come up with people who give you, governments, people, foundations that give you unearmarked donations, and they become your best friends.
Thank you, Mr. Greene, for your heroic efforts. You used the magical word paradox. While the United States is the biggest contributor to humanitarian help, it's also the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. I'm quoting from Martin Luther King a half-century ago. Unless there's policy changes with war-making and climate, nothing is going to change. We have the material and the moral leverage to affect a more peaceful world than what we're doing. We can do it if we had the will to do it.
So I agree with most of that. At the same time, our government and wonderful people I worked with in the administration, and I do think they're wonderful public servants, talked about the need to get in more humanitarian assistance into Gaza. At the same time, we're arming the Israeli government to continue the destruction of Gaza. And you can't balance it out. And that's why I think I emphasize the importance of security and political solutions to these challenges. That's not if you do humanitarian assistance better, it's not going to solve the underlying problem. And frankly, U.S. dropping out of things like the Paris Climate Accords and other things isn't going to help either.
At the beginning of your, thank you for your presentation. At the beginning of your talk, that you said there are, armies of people who are interested in this work. And as we have a society that's like, make America great, America first, has that changed in terms of inspiring new people to go into humanitarian work?
I don't think so. I hope not. I mentor but some kids who, I've had these conversations with. And so I think people very interested in doing that type of work for all the right reasons. What my concern is, a little bit to your point, is that they get scared off. They say, they see what's going on in Washington. They see the hostile arguments. They see the unfair allegations and name calling, and think, I really want to get in the middle of that. And I just hope that doesn't. I hope it does. It doesn't dissuade people from being involved. But I could certainly see that. There was a kid in our neighborhood who grew up with my youngest son, and we have 4 kids, who I spent about the last year with, prepping him to take the Foreign Service exam. And, this kid, he went to grad school in South Africa. He helped start up this NGO. I mean, he is right out of central casting to be in the Foreign Service. I mean, we as a country want this kid in the Foreign Service. So he just texted me earlier, and there's some executive order about reducing employment in the State Department by 30%. And he just started in December, and he thinks, looks like I'm going to be out of here. And I go, don't throw in the towel yet. But and so what I think is, if you can somehow work your way to a program and you're on the ground and you're doing stuff, and in some respects you're oblivious, you're learning things, you're doing good stuff, and you don't really get impacted by the political waves particularly early on in your career. And you sort of keep your head down and just stay focused. And I'm hoping that there'll be enough people in those positions that will be able to keep on keeping on.
Thanks again, Richard, for the really great presentation. And I know our students here will especially gain so much. Could you talk a little bit more about how important, or I would argue, the importance of, and I've heard this from my former students who've gone into development work, the importance of sustainable relationships on the ground. We have this impression, I think, in the United States that we send all these people abroad with all this money and, then forget how important it is to building local relationships. Because ultimately, one of the ways you solve the big problems is you build from the ground up sustainable development that then becomes important and incorporated into the lives of the people who you're trying to serve.
That's a really good point. You're only as good as your local capacity. There was a big focus on localization. There are people that claim that a lot of the localization numbers are sort of fake, that they're not really working directly with local partners. But whether you're working directly with local partners or you're subcontracting local partners or you hire them directly, it doesn't get better unless you develop the capacity for people doing the projects from within the community that you're working in. And that's the only way it gets better. It doesn't get better by flying in people from Washington or Scandinavia, and spending a few months and telling people how to do stuff and then leaving. Let me give you, this is a really good point, really important point, particularly for the future of the whole development industry. One example, when I worked at PAE, the Lockheed offshoot, we led our little company, or not so little company, led the response to the Ebola outbreak in Liberia in 2014. And we were able to do that, one, because I had a leadership team who wanted to run to the fire. And I remember talking to the people, the leaders. I said, you're sure? This is before anybody really knew how to respond to Ebola, and obviously no vaccines. I go, you've read all this stuff, you've seen all this stuff, you could touch somebody and die, and you're willing to do this. And I had the leaders of my team said to me, yeah, it's kind of what we do, it's what we're in business for, and if we don't stop it here, it's going to come to here. And so I had great leadership team. We were able to do this because we did a number of sort of road construction and training projects in Liberia already. So I had 2,000 Liberians on our payroll who we just sort of refocused and retrained, and they turned into Ebola providers. And the whole response to Ebola in Liberia was because Liberian led, and they led the charge, and they figured out the right way of burying people and so on. But it was all due to the success of all our local partners. Nothing happens good unless your local partners are successful in leading the charge.
We'll do one more question.
Thank you. I think it's very difficult for young people these days in today's atmosphere if they're witnessing people in countries like Bangladesh and Somalia, et cetera, when they may be working for an agency and they don't even know if they could buy a plane ticket to get home because they've been fired and they've been basically told that they're not important. And I think that's a situation that we're facing right now, and I don't see it getting any better, at least for a little while, until someone stands up and says, enough is enough. But you speak about the agencies running to the fire and the goodwill of those people. Sometimes I have to wonder, what started the fire in the first place, okay? And are there things that we could be doing as a country? And I don't think we could answer that here, but as a country, so that there are less fires, okay, in the future, so that we don't have to commit as much resources and put the effort at whether it's climate change or political or what's happening in countries where we might be able to affect the leadership of those countries from causing the problems that they're causing today. And I don't know if that's a question or not, but I think it's an issue.
To your first point, there is great chaos and disruption, and people that have done a lot of really good work are being treated horribly. I think a pushback is starting. There are, the number of exemptions and waivers is starting to increase. It's still crazy. People that do this stuff are still going through hell. But, I guess I hope people have some confidence that we'll get to a better balancing point. There's a lot happening now that's keeping us from that, but I think, from the people I talk to, the tide is starting to turn somewhat. Now, will it be the same sort of structure and organization that it was, frankly, 2 or 3 weeks ago or a month ago? Probably not. It's going to be different in a lot of ways. And we'll see if this new amalgam is able to deliver the way the old amalgam. In terms of getting to sort of root causes, for the most part, we as a world, we as a country, U.S. leadership, there's some examples where we've kept bad things from happening that don't really get reported that much, and that's frankly what we thought we did at the State Department for a number of years, was to keep bad things from happening as opposed to actually doing positive stuff. And so all the mechanisms in the world, UN, regional leaderships, regional organization, you cannot look at what's happening, global cooperation on climate, and think it's been effective. It really hasn't been effective and hasn't risen to the challenge. You wonder what it's going to take to come up with more effective mechanisms. Didn't happen with COVID and all the millions of people that died with COVID. And you got to think what it's going to take. It certainly doesn't seem to be happening with Russian invasion of Ukraine. It doesn't seem to be happening in the Middle East. Maybe we'll get to a different outcome there. But you cannot sit there and have any confidence in the mechanisms that have been deployed in the discussions. So I'm with you on that, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Richard, and